Hello there and welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Camp Meyers. We're here every week meeting interesting people and dealing with topical issues. And today, a little bit of history, a little bit of current events.
Yes, we're going to hear about somebody that I frankly had not heard about prior to finding out about this show. A Assistant U.S. Marshal, long since deceased, named Bass Reeves. He's a very popular subject now in the movies, and the curator of the U.S. Marshals Museum in Fort Smith, Arkansas, David Kennedy, is going to be our guest, talking about not only the museum, but Bass Reeves as well.
Fantastic. We're going to learn more about the U.S. Marshals in history and what's going on today to remember the men and women who served in that capacity. It's coming up on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
Right now, 6 feet can feel like a long ways away. But from 6 feet, we can still smile at each other. From our doorways and our stairways, from opposite sides of the street and opposite sides of the country. Through fear and frustrations, we can remind each other that we are still here for each other. Because we can still smile at each other. And we're not going anywhere.
Military service ran in my blood, starting from my father, which joined the Navy, then on the Chickasaw side, my uncle, which served in the United States Army. I'm Benjamin Espinosa, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, and I'm Chickasaw. I went to the Secretary of Defense's staff at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., which ultimately led to becoming a combat support technician for Naval Special Warfare, specifically SEAL Team 10. I think to be proud and to love your tribe, to love being Chickasaw, you also have to love being American. You also have to love everything that America stands for. Equality, perseverance, professionalism, and power. I want my family to know that their father is a good person, but also feels that he has an obligation to the country and to love this nation. Anything worth having is worth dying for. The military and the country owes me nothing. I owe it everything.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofanation.com.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
As we talked about at the beginning, our guest today is David Kennedy. He is a curator of the United States Marshals Service Museum in Fort Smith, Arkansas, now finishing up final construction, not yet open, but about to be open pretty soon. David did his undergraduate work in history at the University of Texas, El Paso, got his master's degree in history from Montana State, and has been involved most of his adult life studying Western history, the life in the West, and the firearms that were used in the process of molding the West. He has had prior experience with working with Bob Blackburn at the Oklahoma History Center, and he was a curator of Buffalo Bill Cody's museum in Wyoming. He is an author, he's a lecturer, and he's a curator, and this is his first appearance on The Verdict. David, glad to have you. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come on. It is a sincere pleasure to be here on The Verdict. Both of you gentlemen are people whose names I've known for years from living over in Enid. That was kind of that part of me working for Oklahoma Historical Society. I was up at the museum there as part of a $10 million reinstallation and expansion and public-private cooperation to make sure that that happened. And so as you mentioned, working with Bob Blackburn and others in that part of the country, and then coming over here, but still shows like yours are very definitely some of the things that helped me understand moving to Oklahoma when I did.
David, I want to learn more about some of the individual marshals that we may have heard of and some that we haven't. But let's talk about the museum, first of all. You're the curator there. What would we expect to see if we traveled down I-40 to Fort Smith and took a look inside?
Well, right now, the building is not yet open to the general public. We did get the building completed a couple of years ago. This has been a very long project, it might seem like, but the amount of time that it's taken to get to where we are is essentially just a few weeks in museum terms sometimes. The museum itself, the home for it here in Fort Smith was chosen by the Marshals Service in 2007. In 2009, they started doing planning and fundraising in earnest. And then when I arrived here in 2015, we were looking at finally getting around to starting to build the building. We had the money in place. We knew what we were wanting to do. So we had the building built. We moved into that building in January of 2020. And that's where I'm sitting in right now, is the museum building that we had built at that time. I'm standing in the one guest-facing experience that we currently have, our Hall of Honor, which recognizes currently 381 people who gave their lives in the line of duty to the mission of the Marshals. One of the reasons why we are here in Fort Smith is because you can't see it with where the camera's pointing, but off in front of me is the Arkansas River and what is now Oklahoma. About a third of the names on the wall behind me are men who lost their lives doing their job in what's now Oklahoma. And so the Marshals Museum, being here in Fort Smith, this is considered sacred ground by the Marshals Service. So over the last couple of years, as we all know, January 2020 was not exactly a great time to be trying to do anything publicly directed with everything that happened with COVID and kind of the shutdown. So for good or for bad, we still had some more money that we needed to raise for our museum experience that's going to be here inside the building. And this last fall, thanks to some very, very generous donors we had a large matching gift, which propelled us towards that goal to build out our museum experience. And so we have 17,000 square feet of empty space in this building that is destined to be the home of this experience, telling the entire 230-year history of the United States Marshals. A lot of people think the Marshals was just something in the Old West. They think it was just something, maybe they might be familiar with the film roles that Tommy Lee Jones played. They might be familiar with the character Waylon Givens. And it goes so much farther than that. This is a story that goes back to George Washington and the very first act of the United States Senate after they first convened in 1789. This goes all the way up to today, not just in the 94 federal court districts across the country. There's 3 foreign offices. There are marshals stationed permanently at Interpol in Europe. There are marshals literally all over the world doing their job, but granted, most of their business is focused here in the United States. So we get to tell this exciting story throughout the history of our country, because in my mind, Marshals history is American history. American history is Marshals history. There's not one major thing that has occurred in the United States over the last 230 plus years that the Marshals didn't just at least touch on a little bit. Whether we're talking about the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania in 1794, or we're talking about some of the current operations against sovereign citizens, organized crime, or just going out after fugitives on a daily basis all across our country, helping city, county, state, and other federal agencies find dangerous fugitives or people who are flight risks. And so it really is just an exciting story and an exciting, very daunting responsibility to be able to tell these stories.
David, you've, I'm sure, done planning or going to continue to do planning about what types of exhibits visitors of the museum will see. Give us an idea, if you can, of, generally speaking, what will the visitors see when they walk in to the main area of the museum? What are the exhibits like? Are they interactive? Just kind of describe it for us, if you will.
Our exhibits are going to be broken up into 5 major areas. The first one, what is a marshal? Trying to answer those basic questions of what they are and what they aren't. They're not the guys who ride around on airplanes. That's a whole nother category. They are people who, since day one, were tasked with protecting the judiciary, enforcing the will of the federal court system, and just essentially making sure that our country continues to operate and that rights are protected for everyone. Our second major area is a little storytelling and a wayfinding area, Stories Under the Stars. It's a small campfire scene where we have 4 figures representing deputy marshals from across our nation's history doing what deputies do when they get together. They tell stories, and hopefully some of them are even going to be true. But as they're telling these stories around this campfire, you're going to see the stories playing out in the smoke, in the shadows up on this rock face up back behind them. And so people can sit and listen to these stories that are kind of an additive element to what they're going to see in the rest of the galleries. There'll be information that'll help them better understand, but if they don't catch all these stories, they aren't going to miss out anywhere else.
David, what was it about the role of the U.S. Marshal in the Old West that seemed to captivate the mind of fiction writers and truth tellers, for that matter? Bat Masterson, Wild Bill Hickok, but also Rooster Cogburn and Matt Dillon. These are some of the most famous people in folklore. Some of them didn't even exist, but I think they were all U.S. Marshals, if my pop culture is correct.
Right. Each of those folks, whether you're talking about fictional or non-fictional, at one point or another in their lives, they were all deputy U.S. Marshals or U.S. Marshals. And that's kind of what the next gallery of our museum talks about, frontier marshals. We talk all the way from when the frontier was the Ohio River Valley to Oklahoma statehood in 1907. And as part of talking about the fact of the West and talking about people like Bass Reeves or the Three Guardsmen or other people who were legitimate deputy marshals at different points, we are also going to be talking, obviously, about the fiction of the West, the fantasy of the West. And so we point out things like how there has never been a U.S. Marshal's office in Dodge City, Kansas. They did add one.
I've been there. I've seen that old Wild West street there in Dodge City. I've seen it.
They added an office there in the 70s that has been typically manned by people who are retired deputy marshals, just kind of for a little bit of flavor, a little bit of advertising. But back in the day, it's like the farthest west that there's a federal court in the state of Kansas, even today, is Wichita. And so if there was ever somebody out as far as Dodge City who was a deputy involved with the marshals, it might have been the city marshal or the county sheriff who was cross-deputized just because the marshal didn't. It's one of those things we think of as the long arm of the law. That's one of the ways they get that long arm of the law. They have people who are local law enforcement who are sometimes deputized. There are people at many levels of law enforcement across the country who receive that ability to help the marshals out. And whenever they're doing a marshal's job or helping the marshal's mission, they're holding the authority of the Marshal Service behind them.
David Kennedy is our guest. He's speaking about the U.S. Marshals Museum that is be opening soon in Fort Smith. We'll have more with David when we get back from this break.
OU Law has a history and heritage that are unparalleled. At the University of Oklahoma College of Law, we empower our students to pursue the career of their dreams. We have the highest U.S. News ranking ever achieved by an Oklahoma law school. We are the first law school in the country to launch a college-wide digital initiative. And this year, our competition teams ranked number 2 in the nation. OU Law, generations of excellence, limitless possibilities.
When I came to work for the ODVA, I started realizing the opportunity to take care of veterans. It's a powerful thing when you realize that you are taking care of people that made history.
Working here is a calling. It's really, really important that they don't just come here to exist. We want to give them meaning to their lives. We try to make life happy and meaningful and fulfilled for our veterans.
welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett and Kent Meyers are here, and our guest is David Kennedy. He's the curator of the U.S. Marshals Museum, which will be opening soon in Fort Smith. And one of the reasons that we had this particular show is there was a large article in the local paper about Bass Reeves. So let's take a look at Bass Reeves. And David, if you will, tell us something about this gentleman who in some ways has been lost to history.
And I think that's a very easy way to call it, is he was very much lost to history. Bass Reeves was born in enslavement. He was born a slave. He literally stole his freedom during the American Civil War and ended up finishing out the back end of the Civil War living in what's now Oklahoma, what was then Indian Territory. We think was down around Choctaw or the Creek areas. And after the war, he grabs his wife. They have a couple of kids down in Texas. They move back up here to this part of the country in Van Buren, Arkansas, where he starts to establish a farm. After a few years, he starts working as a posse member for a few deputies working out of the federal court here in Fort Smith under the famed Judge Isaac Parker. And after a few years—
Is that the hanging judge?
That's a lot of people refer to him as the hanging judge. Myself, I would be really interested in looking at a lot of other judges around the country because I think it's a great nickname, but whether it is, the historian in me always wants to question nicknames like that. But that's for a whole nother day and a whole lot more research. But so Bass is working under the hanging judge. Some people have referred to him as the first black deputy west of the Mississippi. We know that there was another deputy, at least one other deputy, who started working before him, but we have not yet been able to find their name. We are looking at Bass, though, continuing on, starting with this court here in 1875. He continued on until 1907 between the court in Western District of Arkansas here out of Fort Smith. He was working out of the court down in Paris, Texas, during which he was living in southern, what's now southern Oklahoma, down in Choctaw Nation in that area. And then he ends up finishing his career living in Muskogee after the creation of the various court districts in Indian Territory. And he continues on that route until 1907. Oklahoma becomes a state. Bass loses his position as a deputy marshal and then spends the next couple of years working as essentially a beat cop in Muskogee for the Muskogee Police Department. Unfortunately and sadly, in 1809, health finally caught up with him. Bass passes away in 1910 as a result of what was referred to then as Bright's disease. Essentially, it's a kidney ailment. And during the entire time, you figure Bass is working with the mission of the Marshals for most of 32 years. And I say most of because there was about a year and a half or 2 years in the middle of that when he wasn't able to work because he was on trial for the murder of his camp cook, which is still one of the craziest little bits and stories of Bass Reeves. He's sitting there, and it kind of this whole story about the camp cook shows so much about the life of Bass Reeves, and in some cases why some people at the time didn't like him, but yet it also shows how successful he was. Mid 1800s, Bass Reeves is making more money than any of the other deputy marshals who are working out of this district. If you came to today's money, we're talking $80,000, $90,000 a year. And it was because it wasn't always because of just the number that he was bringing in, but he'd figured out how to turn this into a business, how to make money, because each of the deputies are getting paid by the people who they bring in to fulfill the warrants that they're given to go fill. He's bringing in other criminals who he sees in the commission of a crime. He gets mileage for all of these prisoners. He gets a stipend to feed the prisoners. He gets money for a couple of posse members. And so he pretty much turns it into an enterprise and a business where some guys are going out on horseback with one or two people, catch a guy or two, and then come back to Fort Smith. He's going out doing a huge circle throughout Indian Territory. It might be him, maybe another deputy, one or two posse members. He'll have somebody as a camp cook. He'll have somebody driving a wagon with supplies. And so, for example, this event which took place in the early 80s, he accidentally shoots his camp cook, but during all of the testimony for that, you figure out he has 6 or 10 criminals already shacked up in a tent that's built up onto one side. He and his cook and his driver and anybody else, they're staying in another tent. He has the cook making all the food. He's got wagons sitting in back with all the supplies that they need. And in the middle of all this event, he accidentally shoots his camp cook, tries to get medical care for him, and that's the last they hear of it for a couple of years, until some people, and I personally believe it was jealousy on the part of some of the other deputies or some of the other people in Fort Smith who did not like the fact that a black man in the South at that time was making more money and having more success than them. I do believe it was a lot of racial animosity as well as some jealousy, which led to murder charges being filed against Bass in that case of killing William Leach. And by the time that court case is over, he spends 2 years without an income. He had hired the 3 best lawyers here in the city of Fort Smith. One of them was a former U.S. attorney for the district court here, and just essentially bankrupted himself, and then it essentially ruined him and his feelings towards Fort Smith. After that whole case finally finished, he goes to Paris, Texas, works out of there, eventually ends up in Muskogee. But to the point of him being written out of history, after his death in 1910, this guy who we believe to be the most prolific law enforcement officer in United States history, he just disappears outside of a small community in Muskogee and some people who are very serious scholars of Black lawmen in America. His story is just gone from history, whereas other stories continue to progress into the stratosphere. You end up finally in the 50s, there was a student writing a history paper at University of Oklahoma, uncovers some of the story, interviews one of Bass's children. That story gets into the hands of some academics. So by the 60s and 70s, academics are writing about it. By the 80s and 90s, you finally get Art Burton, who writes the book, which if anybody wants to read and learn about Bass Reeves, I always recommend they start out with Art Burton's Black Gun, Silver Star. He writes that book, and then finally it starts to become popular. And then so I get my day job, which usually once or twice a week, I have to try and squash some rumor about Bass Reeves that's not true. Which unfortunately happens more than I'd like, but we do get to take care of that. And I get to look at Bass Reeves. I get to look at his family and descendant tree. I get to look at the stories about him, and I get to learn more about this region. I get to learn more about Bass Reeves as a lawman. I get to learn more about other Black deputies who served here in Parker's Court and elsewhere. And better yet, we get to help develop those stories so we can tell these stories in our main experience when we open up later this year.
David, let me ask you, you mentioned about the money that Bass Reeves made as a marshal. There was a show a long time ago called Wanted Dead or Alive. From what I have read, the marshal actually got more money bringing him back alive than he did bringing him back dead. In fact, he didn't get paid anything if he brought him back dead.
That's pretty accurate. That's pretty accurate. It's one of those things that if you can't bring them back to justice, you're not going to make any money, unless in some cases there might have been a reward on that person, dead or alive, and you bring back the corpse, you're going to get that reward. But in most cases, and the rewards themselves weren't even that much. Typically anywhere from $100, $150 to at the most $500. You might see some rare cases going up above 1,000, but in most cases, into today's money, that ends up translating much higher. But you're never going to see $50,000, $20,000 on a wanted poster from the 1800s. It just simply wasn't in the bank.
David, what can our viewers to help you and your cause and the museum itself?
Well, one of the things that they can do is they can come to either our webpage at usmmuseum.org. They can go to our Facebook page, just go to Facebook, punch in U.S. Marshals Museum, and through either one of those, there are means to donate and give to our programs. Right now, as part of this $50 million project, we are still in the last $2.7 million that we have left to raise. That's for furniture, fixtures, and equipment, essentially doing crazy things like buying desks and computers from some of our future staff members. And we are very, very close to completing this project and moving towards the future to when we are going to be able to share this story with America.
David Kennedy with U.S. Marshals Museum in Fort Smith. Thanks so much for being a part of our show today.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a genuine pleasure.
And I'll be back with a final word after this.
It used to be okay in teachers' lounges. It used to be okay in maternity wards. It was okay in sporting arenas, college campuses, and office spaces. But now that we understand the deadly dangers of secondhand smoke, that's not okay anymore. So why is it okay that thousands of employees are exposed to it every day at work? Bottom line, it's not okay. Let's protect hardworking Oklahomans. Join the fight at stopswithme.com.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
I think for us, once we got started and we began to see the tremendous need just within our state, it really was just a calling for us. The blessings far outweigh any obstacles that we've faced.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
We had a good visit today with David Kennedy, who's the curator of the U.S. Marshals Museum in Fort Smith, and he would love for you to go on their website and perhaps donate to their cause. That's usmmuseum.org, usmmuseum.org. And we have a website, theverdict.tv. Tell us about a guest you'd like to see on a future show. That's going to do it for this week. For Kent, I'm Mick. We'll see you next time on The Verdict.